What's up, my Sunlight Samurais? So, I think this is going to be an absolute banger of a video. I can just feel it. You might be surprised to hear me say this, but even though I've spent years investigating scientific research on hair loss on this channel and have posted hundreds of videos on my findings here on YouTube, I just watched a video about a guy who cured his hair loss naturally, and I just realized I've been wrong about everything this whole time. I mean, why delve into the mysteries of the Wnt pathway and TGF-beta when the cure for hair loss has been right in front of our noses this whole time? Let's forget about these so-called cures like Finasteride and minoxidil that Big Pharma has foisted upon us just to make profits for their shareholders. We don't have to look any further than to Mother Nature herself to find the natural cure for hair loss. Now, you may be thinking, but Kevin, there can't be a natural method for stopping hair loss, otherwise we would have known about it by now. But if you believe that tripe, then I'm sorry to say you've fallen prey to Big Pharma's propaganda. They don't want you to believe that there is a natural treatment for hair loss that is both more effective and more efficient than the soyant slop they like to peddle. Pharmaceutical companies cannot put a patent on nature. They know that. So they know that the only way they're going to profit off of other people's desire to stop hair loss is by making them dependent on the drugs they're selling. The truth is that there is a cure for hair loss, one that is 100% drug-free and natural. I've discovered that there is a way to free yourself not just from the curse of baldness, but also from the slavery of Big Pharma's crony capitalism. So, what is the solution, you may wonder? Well, the answer lies in the ancestral wisdom of our forebears. Baldness is not genetic, and it certainly is not caused by DHT. We know this because baldness is a recent phenomenon that was almost non-existent in ancient times. Today, if you go to any public place like malls or gyms, you'll find more bald people than at any point in history, and we're seeing it happen more and more often than ever, especially with young people. If you go back 10,000 years ago, though, you will almost never see any photographs of bald people. That's because our ancestors, through millions of years of evolution, acquired the intuition to know what is necessary for optimal health, including hair health. That's why humans, when they are in their natural state of being, will never go bald or suffer any health problems whatsoever. If humans want to return to this optimal form of living, then they need to return to nature. It is when humans turned away from nature and started embracing unnatural man-made constructs like science and medicine, as well as man-made unnatural foods like fruits, grains, and vegetables that contain lectins, oxalates, and other anti-nutrients, that people started becoming sicker, balder, and less happy. So, how does one break free from this modern-day slavery and return to nature so they can reclaim their health, hair, and their freedom? Well, there's some basic things you can do right now. First of all, let's get one thing out of the way. DHT does not cause hair loss. Hair loss is predominantly a problem that relates to scalp tension, blood flow, heavy metals, nutritional deficiencies, and inflammation. So, you may be thinking, if DHT doesn't cause hair loss, then why do people who have androgenetic alopecia have more DHT on their scalp? Well, that's just a correlation, and it doesn't prove causation. Remember, association can never inform upon causation, so all studies are worthless unless they tell me what I want to hear. DHT is not a cause of hair loss. It is just a response to other factors that cause hair loss, like inflammation and scalp tension. So, by lowering DHT, you're not actually doing anything to stop hair loss. DHT is just a byproduct of hair loss. It is not a cause of it. So, if you want to actually stop hair loss, you need to treat the factors that are causing DHT to build up on the scalp, like scalp tension and inflammation. So, how do we know that scalp tension causes hair loss, you may wonder? Well, let's just take a look at the Botox data. We have hard evidence that people treated with Botox see improvement in hair growth, and how does Botox work? It's a muscle relaxer. So, by relaxing the scalp perimeter muscles with Botox, you increase blood flow to the hair follicles, and that promotes hair growth. And if Botox promotes hair growth, that must mean scalp massages promote hair growth too, because massaging your scalp does the same thing as Botox. Do I have any actual evidence for that? No, but it makes sense to me, so I'm going to go with that anyways. Of course, there are some people who will claim that Botox works through other mechanisms besides relaxing muscles and increasing blood flow to the scalp. Like, for example, there is data that shows that Botox lowers TGF-beta 1, which is a negative growth factor and a downstream effect of DHT. Also, I think it's best to ignore the fact that the 3 most recent randomized controlled trials on using Botox showed no significant hair growth in subjects with androgenetic alopecia. And there is also data that in women, Botox injections in the forehead cause recession of their hairline. But what does this all tell you? It proves that science isn't reliable in the slightest. We have studies that shows that it works and others that shows that it doesn't work. So, rather than me taking the time to critically analyze these studies to learn more about their specific strengths and flaws, I'm going to just declare that that the studies that agree with me are the ones that are correct, while declaring that all science that doesn't agree with me is bad, and I'm going to rely on my intuition instead. Intuition is something humans develop through billions of years of evolution, and anyone who thinks some man-made theological construct like science can override intuition and some good old-fashioned common sense is crazy. Also, what about minoxidil? You can't be a minoxidil shill and simultaneously believe that blood flow has nothing to do with hair loss when the only thing minoxidil actually does is that it causes vasodilation, which literally means it causes increased blood flow to the hair follicles. That's all it does. Minoxidil literally has no other effect other than vasodilation. Of course, we also need to ignore the fact that there are many other vasodilating drugs that don't have any effect on hair growth, like calcium channel blockers, ACE inhibitors, beta blockers, and nitrates. Also, we need to ignore the fact that minoxidil has many other effects besides vasodilation, such as being a potassium channel opener, a prostaglandin modulator, a Wnt pathway stimulant, and it has plenty of other effects that have nothing to do with vasodilation at all. I'm sure none of that has anything to do with minoxidil's mechanism of action, though, and it's all just because of blood flow. I'm going to ignore all these other mechanisms because the vasodilation mechanism better supports my theory about blood flow, and anyone who tells you minoxidil works through other means is just a big pharma shill, so fuck them. Of course, scalp tension is the main reason people go bald, because when the scalp is tight, that constricts the blood vessels and reduces blood flow to the scalp. Never mind the fact that we have examples of people balding in a traditional Norwood pattern despite having scalp conditions that causes the scalp to be loose, like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And never mind the fact that research shows that massaging the muscles doesn't actually improve blood flow at all. Never mind the fact that surgeons can ligate the superficial temporal artery, which is the artery that supplies blood to the scalp, and that still does not cause any hair loss whatsoever. Never mind the fact that people born with a 5-AR deficiency will never go bald regardless of scalp tension. Never mind the fact that the scalp vascular network isn't even affected by scalp tension, since the arteries run above the muscles and the gallia aponeurotica as opposed to under it, so tense muscles wouldn't constrict them. Never mind the fact that the scalp vascular network is redundant, so even if an artery is blocked off, blood flow will just increase in the other arteries so that the total blood supply to the scalp remains unchanged. Never mind the fact that the theory behind blood flow was based on just one opinion piece from Dr. Goldman, where he claimed that lower oxygen levels causes more DHT buildup, but this theory has never been tested and verified. Never mind the fact that the image of scalp tension used by its proponents is just a 2-dimensional computer model, which wouldn't correspond with a scalp, which is of a 3-dimensional proportion. Not to mention the fact that actual scalp tension has never been shown to be increased in human scalps that are real. Never mind the fact that the blood flow theory was already debunked back in 1916. Never mind the fact that you can transplant hair follicles from the scalp to the arm and they'll still miniaturize at the same rate despite not being affected by scalp tension. Never mind the fact that lower blood flow in the scalps of bald men is just a consequence of hair loss rather than a cause, since fewer hair follicles means fewer capillaries, since the microvascular structure of the hair follicles will die when the hair follicle dies. Never mind the fact that you can induce hair loss just by applying DHT to the backs of mice. Never mind the fact that we have ex vivo data that shows that when DHT is applied to a human hair follicle, it will cause miniaturization even when there are no other factors present at all. Never mind the fact that DHT is produced internally by the 5-AR enzyme, which is present on the scalp, and that bald men have more 5-AR activity and a greater density of androgen receptors on their hair follicles, which is clearly a genetic trait. Never mind the fact that steroid users will experience an acceleration of hair loss when the 5-AR enzyme is not suppressed, which is why people on TRT often will use finasteride to stop such a thing. And never mind the fact that we have randomized controlled trials with thousands of subjects that show that finasteride stops and reverses hair loss in the vast majority of men. And finally, never mind the fact that those studies have been verified by subsequent independent studies that have no affiliation with any finasteride producers whatsoever. Just take my word for it, though. All that information is complete nonsense because it's based on science, and science is a woke man-made construct, so even if it seems convincing, that is only because it is meant to fool you. Let's go ahead and talk about how dangerous these DHT-lowering drugs actually are. Taking finasteride is only effective if you want to turn into a woman. I should know, because I used to use finasteride and it turned me into a woman, but fortunately, I got better after I stopped it. But I can tell you that 100% of men taking finasteride, without exception, have side effects, even if they don't realize it. That's because men today are such pussies that they don't realize they're already emasculated. If they were to just simply embrace a primal lifestyle like I do, they would know what it means to be a real man. And you could tell I'm living a primal lifestyle because I stepped outside my house today, and look, I'm outside, I'm in nature, so I'm living a primal lifestyle. So you can go ahead and just ignore those studies that show that the incidence of side effects from finasteride is only 2% higher than placebo, and you can also ignore those studies that show that dutasteride has an even lower incidence of side effects despite suppressing DHT by an even greater amount than finasteride. On the surface, that would seem to imply that finasteride side effects have nothing at all to do with lowering DHT, but that can't be trusted because DHT is the ultimate top-tier Chad hormone for strength, masculinity, and sexual prowess. It's way more important than testosterone. Now, sure, if you look at the science behind it, they'll tell you that DHT doesn't have any important functions in men past puberty, and that in adulthood, DHT is just a paracrine hormone that works on select tissues like the scalp, skin, and the prostate, where it only does bad things like hair loss, acne, and an enlarged prostate. You may also see some science saying that DHT is not necessary for building muscle and strength because adding dutasteride to testosterone supplementation has no effect on muscle development. And please, whatever you do, make sure you ignore the fact that free DHT levels are extremely low because DHT is even more tightly bound to SHBG than testosterone is, and thus the hormone in its natural state does not have any systemic effects besides being a paracrine hormone that makes you a bald, pizza-faced old man that makes taking a piss feel like deadlifting 500 pounds. And by the way, speaking of old men, if the hypothesis about DHT is real, then how come old men keep getting balder and balder despite their DHT levels continuing to drop as they get older? Well, if you listen to the science, they'll say that androgenetic alopecia doesn't correlate with serum DHT anyways because it's scalp DHT that matters, not serum DHT. And the woke science-pushing soy boys will also say that old men also continue to lose hair because they develop additional forms of hair loss, like senescent alopecia, which is cosmetically similar to androgenic alopecia, but not related to androgens in the slightest. It's crazy, because it seems like it's almost like it's scalp DHT that matters as opposed to serum DHT, but you should ignore all this data, because anyone who wants to actually suppress their DHT levels is a woke cuck, and if you take finasteride, you're going to be made fun of for it, and you deserve it. So, now that I've proved what actually causes hair loss, what do I actually recommend to treat hair loss? Well, the main problem with your hair is definitely not DHT. It's the lack of nutrients. Men are balding today because they reject the primal lifestyle of our ancestors from the Stone Age who never lived long enough to go bald, but until someone can actually show me a photograph of a bald caveman, I'm convinced that hair loss never happened before civilization. It's only when people started eating man-made foods like fruits, grains, and vegetables that hair loss became a real thing. So obviously the first step here is to eat an all-meat diet, since cavemen obviously never ate plants, even those that lived in the tropics and were surrounded by edible plants all year round. They would never touch those though, because they knew they were full of anti-nutrients. If you really want to regrow your hair though, it's not enough just to eat good nutrition. You've also got to apply good nutrition directly to your scalp. So the first thing you want to do is apply raw eggs directly to your scalp. And I don't want to hear any of you whiny bitches complain that it's not working. The only reason it's not working for you is because you're not leaving it on long enough. You need to leave the eggs on your scalp for at least 24 hours a day, if not longer. And you need to do this consistently for at least 2 years before expecting results. So I don't care if you're at work or the gym, you need to keep the eggs on your scalp. And frankly, you shouldn't be at the gym or at work anyways, because those are unnatural man-made constructs. If anyone complains about the smell of the eggs, then that's just because they're brainwashed slaves. Also, please ignore the fact that raw egg whites contain avidin, which is an anti-nutrient that binds to biotin and can actually lower biotin levels, which in turn can cause hair loss, since biotin deficiencies can be a real cause of hair loss. Don't worry about that though. I've applied raw eggs myself many times, and it definitely works because the nutrients and protein in the egg whites will compensate for the biotin deficiency. Case in point, eggs have collagen in them. Collagen is extremely important for hair growth, even though hair follicles don't contain any collagen. They're made from keratin instead. Also, collagen doesn't penetrate the skin to begin with, since the molecular weight of collagen doesn't meet the criteria of the 500 Dalton rule, so that's why it's important that when you apply eggs to your scalp, you microneedle your scalp first. That will allow the eggs to seep into the open wounds and meet the hair follicles, which will then be saturated with collagen that the hair follicles have no use for. But trust me on this one. This works because I saw a guy on YouTube say it works for him, and even though there's no way to verify any of his claims, I'll still trust someone's personal experience over a man-made scientific study any day of the week. So, the other nutritional component you need to include in your hair loss stack is pig fat, also known as lard. Now, I know there is no research on this, but that's only because Big Pharma would never run a study on lard because they know it would work and they wouldn't be able to sell their poisonous man-made chemicals to the masses anymore. I can tell you right now that there have been experiments done where people have had pig lard applied directly to their scalp and they regrew a significant amount of hair because it applied nutrition directly to the scalp. So, where are all these experiments? Well, shit, I don't know, but if I had to guess, I bet it's because Big Pharma used their influence to silence these groundbreaking experiments from the masses. Also, we know that pig lard works because if you look at pigs in the wild, they're absolutely covered in hair. So, if pig lard works for pigs, it clearly will work for humans too. And guys, if you're going to put fat on your scalp, make sure it is a good healthy fat, like lard, tallow, or another RFK Jr. approved saturated fat. Whatever you do, don't apply seed oils to your scalp because your hair will disappear overnight and you'll become gay. So don't say I didn't warn you. So, if it isn't already obvious, the key to regrowing all of your hair and never having to worry about hair loss ever again is to embrace a primal lifestyle. This doesn't just pertain to nutrition though, you also have to embrace the sun. Cavemen didn't have sunscreen and they didn't ever wear hats either. They spent all day in the sun and because of this, they never went bald and they lived a very healthy life until they died at the age of 30. If we as a society can return to this primal and species-specific way of living, we can aim for the same type of lifespan. Just remember, anyone who is over the age of 30 is being kept alive by unnatural means. So, anyone who's over 30 and is still alive is definitely not healthy. They're just being kept alive by man-made drugs and machines. And perhaps the worst of these man-made inventions is sunscreen. The sun has been revered by every ancient culture as a divine source of energy, and that's exactly what it is. It is the source of all life, and there's no way that a giant nuclear fusion reactor that is 1.3 million times the size of the Earth and produces the equivalent of 10 trillion megaton hydrogen bombs per second could possibly have any potential hazards to human life. The fact is that the sun is a bountiful source of vitamin D, and vitamin D is crucial for hair growth. So, rather than get your vitamin D from food or take a supplement, make sure you expose your skin and your scalp to as much sunlight and ultraviolet radiation as you possibly can. Now, you may be worried about things like sunburns, but our ancestors never got sunburns. You look at any pictures of cavemen and you will never see any of them with sunburns. The reason for this is because they didn't eat seed oils. Before seed oils were invented and became mainstream in the 20th century, there was never a single recorded event in human history of anyone getting a sunburn. You can go ahead and look that up. So the sun doesn't cause sunburns, seed oils do, and that's because seed oils cause peroxidation in the skin that destroys our natural protection against UV radiation, which would be better than SPF 100 sunscreen. So, if you cut out the seed oils and replace it with tallow and lard, your skin will develop superpowers that modern woke science just can't comprehend. Of course, the pro-science Marxists will tell you that sun exposure isn't a good source of vitamin D, and it's much easier to just get it from your food or through supplementation without the risk of skin aging due to ultraviolet light radiation. But if you go to YouTube and look at these primal influencers, their skin looks pretty damn good. It's almost as if they have the skin of teenagers, and maybe that's because most of them actually are teenagers. But I'm sure their young age has nothing to do with it. It's just their primal, species-specific lifestyle and diet that makes them look so young. Let's face it, despite all the supposed evidence that androgenetic alopecia is a genetic condition involving over 250 genes related to abnormalities in the 5-AIR enzyme and receptors in the hair follicles, despite the fact that the biochemistry of hair loss and the downstream effects of DHT have been worked out in literally hundreds of basic research studies published by researchers all over the world who conducted their research independently of any corporate support, despite all that, let's face it, the real cause of hair loss is heavy metals and shampoos. Before shampoo was invented, nobody went bald. I challenge anyone to find me any evidence of anyone going bald before 1903 when the first commercial shampoos were invented. Also, it makes perfect sense that hair loss is becoming more and more common due to heavy metal contamination, especially since heavy metal contamination has dropped dramatically in the past several decades due to the removal of lead in gasoline and the replacement of leaded paint and lead pipes with non-leaded alternatives. There are also problems with heavy metal contamination of seafood, especially with mercury specifically, but that's not a problem for me, of course, because I catch my salmon with my bare hands in the natural streams of Alaska and I eat it while it's still raw and wiggling. This is something I recommend everyone do, of course, and clearly heavy metal consumption is the biggest cause of hair loss, which is why nations like Japan have such a higher rate of hair loss compared to European countries. Seriously, you go to East Asian countries where they eat a lot of fish like Japan and Korea, and there are bald people everywhere, way more common than any Western nation. So now that I've proven that I'm smarter than every scientist in the world, let me close off by explaining why science is bad and that we should rely on personal experimentation and traditional wisdom instead. Science today claims that tobacco causes cancer and heart disease, but if you turn back the clock a bit and look at these old advertisements from the 1950s, there were doctors who actually endorsed smoking. So clearly, personal anecdotal experience is much more important than science. And a more modern example of this is with statins. There are many studies showing that statins lower LDL cholesterol and lower the risk of heart disease. However, clearly the researchers doing these studies are just paid shills from Big Pharma. However, if you go to YouTube, you'll find channels that will tell you the truth about statins and that they are actually extremely poisonous. And of course, none of these influencers are actually selling anything, except of course for supplements, programs, books, subscriptions, and documentary movies, but they clearly don't have any conflict of interest because only scientists and Big Pharma are interested in making money, and nobody has ever gotten rich by pushing fad diets and supplements. Never. The supplement industry is valued at $152 billion per year, but all this money is used to counter the propaganda of Big Pharma. So the profits these supplement pushers are making are entirely altruistic and never, not at all, driven by things like greed. So it's time to go ahead and throw that finasteride minoxidil into the trash, and you should go to the supermarket and pick up some lard and eggs instead. The real big three of hair loss is lard, eggs, sunlight, and raw milk. This is something we've known about since ancient times, and the only reason we've been kept in the dark about this for so long is because there's a cabal of venture capitalists and international bankers who serve a sinister agenda from the shadows. I think you guys know exactly who I'm talking about. It's the Illuminati, the Freemasons, and the Knights Templar. They already took control over legacy media a long time ago, but now they're trying to wrap their tentacles around social media as well, and the only way we're going to fight back against this is by spreading the truth. So before I part ways with you today, let me leave you with these words of wisdom. Always keep learning, and don't allow the slaves to prevent you from exploring truth beyond the mainstream paradigm. Keep ascending. Farewell.